In today's video, I want to share a story that still makes me pause whenever I think about it. A story about loneliness, unexpected companionship, and a relationship that slowly turned into something far more complicated than either of us ever imagined. My mother-in-law didn't like being alone, and to be honest, neither did I. It sounds simple when you say it like that. Almost harmless. But sometimes the smallest truths carry the biggest consequences. When I first married my wife, I thought I understood what family life would look like. You know the picture most of us imagine: a quiet home, normal routines, the occasional family dinner, and maybe the typical awkward moments with in-laws that everyone jokes about. My mother-in-law was always polite, a little reserved, and honestly, a bit lonely. My father-in-law had passed away years earlier, and since then she had been living by herself in a small house just a few streets away from ours. At the beginning, our relationship was completely ordinary. She'd invite us over for dinner sometimes, ask about work, talk about the past, and tell the same stories she had probably told 100 times before. If you looked at it from the outside, nothing about our family dynamic seemed unusual. But loneliness has a quiet way of changing people. After my wife started working longer hours, things began to shift. She would leave early in the morning and come home late at night, exhausted from work. Most evenings it was just me sitting at home, scrolling through my phone, watching TV, or trying to find something to do with the silence filling the house. And apparently, I wasn't the only one dealing with that silence. One evening, my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Are you busy?" she asked. I told her no. She said she just didn't like the house being so quiet. That was the first time I went over to keep her company. We had tea, talked about random things, and after an hour or two I went home. It felt harmless. Just a small act of kindness for someone who was clearly struggling with being alone. But then it happened again. And again. Soon, those casual visits became a routine. Sometimes we'd watch old movies. Sometimes we'd sit in the kitchen and talk about life. Sometimes we didn't even talk at all, just the presence of another person in the room was enough to make the silence feel less heavy. If I'm being honest, those evenings started to mean something to me too. Because the truth was, I didn't like being alone either. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just two people dealing with loneliness in their own way. But over time, something about the situation began to feel different. The conversations got deeper. The silences felt heavier. And there were moments, small moments, where I realized this arrangement might not be as simple as I had convinced myself it was. And then one night, something happened that made me realize we had already crossed a line neither of us had even noticed. A moment that changed everything. And the worst part, by the time I understood what was really happening, it was already too late. That night started like many of the others. My wife was working late again, and the house felt unusually quiet. I tried distracting myself with a movie, but my mind kept wandering. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was her again, my mother-in-law. The message was simple: "If you're not busy, would you like to come over for tea?" For a moment, I stared at the screen. By then, those visits had already become part of my routine. Still, something about that message felt different. Maybe it was the way she phrased it, or maybe it was just the strange feeling that had been growing inside me for weeks. But eventually, I grabbed my keys and drove over like I had done so many times before. When I arrived, the porch light was already on. She opened the door almost immediately, like she had been standing there waiting. Her smile was warm, but there was something else in her expression that I couldn't quite read. The house smelled like fresh tea and cinnamon, and the living room lights were dim, giving the place a calm, quiet atmosphere. We sat at the kitchen table and started talking like usual. At first it was the normal conversation: how work was going, how busy my wife had been lately, and small stories about neighbors or things she had seen during the day. But after a while, the conversation slowly drifted into deeper territory. She started talking about loneliness again. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. She told me how strange the house felt at night, how the silence sometimes made the walls feel bigger than they really were. She mentioned how after her husband passed away, evenings became the hardest part of the day. That was when memories seemed the loudest. I listened, trying to be supportive, But something about hearing her speak so honestly made the moment feel heavier than usual. Then she said something that stuck with me. She told me that sometimes the hardest part of being alone isn't the silence, it's the feeling that no one really notices it. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The room was completely still except for the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. That was when I realized something surprising about myself. I understood exactly what she meant. Because lately, I had been feeling something very similar. My wife was constantly busy, our schedules barely lined up, and most nights it felt like we were just passing each other in the same house. Maybe that's why those visits had started to mean more than I expected. But then something unusual happened. As we sat there talking, she suddenly reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was enough to make the room feel completely different. And in that quiet moment, I had a strange feeling that this simple routine we had created was slowly turning into something neither of us had planned. For a moment, I didn't know how to react. Her hand was warm, resting lightly over mine, and the gesture felt both comforting and confusing at the same time. She didn't say anything right away, and neither did I. The only sound in the kitchen was the quiet ticking of that clock on the wall, reminding me how strangely still the moment had become. Then she slowly pulled her hand back, almost as if she had just realized what she'd done. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Sometimes I forget myself when I'm talking." I nodded quickly, trying to brush the moment off like it was nothing. And maybe it really was nothing. Just a small moment between two people who were both dealing with the same thing, loneliness. But as the evening went on, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had shifted between us. After that night, I started noticing small things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way she seemed genuinely happy whenever I came over. The way our conversations lasted longer than they used to. Sometimes we'd talk for hours without even realizing how late it had gotten. At the same time, things at home felt more distant. My wife was busier than ever, often coming home too tired to even have a real conversation. Our schedules rarely matched anymore, and the quiet in our house seemed to grow heavier every day. That's when a question started forming in the back of my mind, one I didn't want to think about too much. Was I visiting my mother-in-law just to help her feel less alone, or was I also trying to fill a silence in my own life? The more I tried to ignore that thought, the louder it seemed to get. And then one evening, something happened that made that question impossible to avoid. It was a small moment. Something simple. But it made me realize that this situation, this strange bond we had created, might already be heading somewhere neither of us was prepared for. The moment happened a few days later, and it caught me completely off guard. It was a quiet evening again. My wife had texted earlier saying she would be working late, which by then had become pretty normal. I was sitting at home trying to pass the time when my phone buzzed. Another message from my mother-in-law. This time she didn't ask if I could come over. She simply wrote, "I made dinner. If you haven't eaten yet, you're welcome to join me." For a few seconds I stared at the message. Something about it felt different. Maybe it was how natural it sounded, like it was already expected that I would come. Still, I grabbed my jacket and drove over. When I arrived, the house felt warmer than usual. The kitchen lights were on, soft music was playing in the background, and the smell of freshly cooked food filled the air. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, greeting me with the same warm smile she always had. We sat down at the table and started eating. At first the conversation was light and easy, but slowly it turned more personal again. She talked about how quiet the house had been earlier that day, how sometimes the evenings felt longer than they should. I shared a little about my own routine, about how strange it felt spending so many nights alone while my wife worked late. It was one of those conversations where time disappears. Before I realized it, the clock on the wall was already showing almost midnight. That's when something unexpected happened. My phone suddenly lit up on the table. A message from my wife. She was coming home earlier than planned. My heart skipped for a second as I read it. I hadn't told her where I was tonight, and suddenly the quiet kitchen felt a lot less comfortable than it had just moments ago. I looked up, unsure what to say, and that's when my mother-in-law noticed the change in my face. "Is everything okay?" she asked. And in that moment, I realized this situation we had casually stepped into might be about to face its most difficult test. For a second, I just stared at the message on my phone. Leaving work early tonight. I'll be home soon. It was a simple text, the kind that normally wouldn't mean much. But in that moment, sitting at my mother-in-law's kitchen table late at night, it suddenly felt a lot heavier than it should have. I quickly locked my phone and tried to act normal, but she had already noticed the change in my expression. "Was that my daughter?" she asked gently. I hesitated before nodding. "Yeah," she said, "she's heading home earlier than usual." For a brief moment, the room felt strangely quiet again. The same silence that had been comfortable earlier now felt tense, like the air itself had changed. She looked down at the table for a second, slowly stirring the tea in her cup. "Well," she said softly, "then you should probably get going." Her voice sounded calm, but something about the moment felt complicated. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and thanked her for dinner. She walked me to the door like she always did. But just as I was about to step outside, she said something that made me stop. "You know," she said quietly, "these evenings, they've meant a lot to me." I turned back toward her, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything, she added, "It's nice having someone around who understands what it feels like when a house becomes too quiet." There was nothing inappropriate about what she said. In fact, it sounded honest, even vulnerable. But hearing it out loud made me realize something I had been avoiding for weeks. Those evenings had started to mean something to both of us. I nodded slowly, trying to keep the moment simple. "I'm glad I could help." But as I stepped outside and walked toward my car, a strange feeling followed me. It wasn't guilt exactly, but it wasn't comfort either. The drive home felt longer than usual. My mind kept replaying the conversation, the late-night dinners, the long talks about loneliness, and the quiet understanding that had slowly formed between us. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The lights inside the house were already on. My wife's car was parked outside. She was home earlier than expected. I walked toward the front door, trying to calm the strange tension building in my chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. But the moment I stepped inside, I saw her standing in the living room. And the first thing she said made my heart sink. "Where were you tonight?" For a moment, I froze in the doorway. My wife was standing there with her arms crossed, her expression calm but serious. The question hung in the air between us, heavier than I expected. "Where were you tonight?" I tried to answer casually, but even I could hear the hesitation in my voice. "I was just visiting your mom. She made dinner and asked if I wanted to come by." My wife didn't react right away. She simply watched me for a few seconds, like she was trying to read something in my face. Then she slowly walked over and sat down on the couch. "You've been going there a lot lately," she said. Her tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't light either. It sounded more like someone trying to understand something that didn't quite make sense. I sat down across from her, unsure how to explain something that had slowly become normal to me. "She gets lonely," I said honestly. "You know that. I just go there sometimes to keep her company." My wife looked down at her hands for a moment before letting out a small sigh. "I know she gets lonely," she said quietly. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you." That wasn't the response I expected. She looked back up at me and continued. "I stopped by her house earlier today after work. She told me you've been visiting, having tea, watching movies, helping her pass the time." For a split second, my heart started racing. I wasn't sure what she thought about all of it. But then she said something that completely surprised me. "Honestly," she said, "I'm glad you've been there for her." I blinked, not expecting that reaction at all. "She's been struggling with being alone for years," my wife continued. "And lately she's been happier. She told me having someone to talk to in the evenings makes the house feel alive again." The tension that had been building in my chest slowly started to ease. But then my wife leaned back against the couch and gave me a small, thoughtful look. "There's just one thing that surprised me." I frowned slightly. "What's that?" She paused for a moment before answering. "When I stopped by earlier today, she asked me if I thought you might like to help her with something." I waited, confused. My wife smiled a little. She's thinking about moving. That caught me completely off guard. Moving where? I asked. My wife shrugged lightly. She said living alone in that house doesn't make sense anymore. Then she looked directly at me and added, she's thinking about finding a smaller place, somewhere closer to us. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Because suddenly, all those quiet evenings, those conversations about loneliness, and the strange connection we had built didn't feel like something temporary anymore. And as my wife watched my reaction carefully, I realized something important. This situation wasn't ending. In fact, it might just be beginning. For a few seconds, I just sat there trying to process what she had said. Her mother moving closer to us was not something I had ever imagined. All those quiet evenings at her house had felt temporary, like a small chapter that would eventually fade away. But now it sounded like things were about to change in a much bigger way. My wife watched my reaction carefully. You look surprised, she said with a small smile. I guess I am, I admitted. She never mentioned that to me. She's been thinking about it for a while, my wife explained. Living alone has been hard for her. And honestly, I've been worried about her too. Hearing that made me realize something important. The evenings I spent there had started because of loneliness, but they had also revealed something deeper about our family. Sometimes people don't ask directly for help. Sometimes they just need someone to notice. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to change. My wife began visiting her mom more often, especially on weekends. The three of us started having dinner together sometimes instead of those quiet one-on-one evenings I had gotten used to. The house that once felt silent started filling with conversation again. Eventually, my mother-in-law found a small apartment not far from our neighborhood. It wasn't a big place, but it was warm, comfortable, and close enough that she could visit anytime she wanted. On the day we helped her move in, she looked happier than I had seen her in a long time. While we were carrying the last few boxes inside, she looked at both of us and said something simple but meaningful. Thank you for not letting me stay alone. In that moment, everything about the past few months made sense. Those late-night talks, the shared dinners, the quiet moments of understanding, they weren't about crossing lines or creating problems. They were about connection. About recognizing when someone you care about needs a little support. Life slowly returned to a new normal after that. My wife and I still had our busy schedules, but we made more effort to spend time together. And her mom stopped by often, sometimes bringing tea, sometimes just bringing stories to share. Looking back, I realized that loneliness can appear in the most ordinary places, quiet houses, long evenings, even busy families. But sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness, one visit, or one conversation to remind someone that they're not truly alone. And in the end, that simple truth brought our family closer than any of us expected.